Massive thank you as always to our top tier patrons Sarah Turner and Alexander Lashley. It's Not Just In Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet, addiction and substance misuse disorder counsellor Ikoi Hero, and myself, editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So if you can afford to support the podcast, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making this show. However, if you can't, then please just tell your friends about us, leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube. This week, we decided to briefly discuss some of the notable episodes and guests from 2022. We also talk about the rise of remote mental health treatment and the latest cool AI website ChatGPT, or should that be ChatCBT? We discuss the chronic rise in loneliness and the cruel side effects of isolation. And we finish up by addressing a Patreon's concerns about how to address the feeling of being overwhelmed by all the problems of the world.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Just in terms of sort of reflecting on the year that has been, Ikoi sort of marked the beginning of the year, joining the podcast, and then reflecting on how many episodes we've done, obviously a year's worth, but it was crazy when I actually looked through the list, the amount of guests that we've had. And Spotify does this sort of wrapped thing at the end of the year. It tells you various stats. And on the Spotify platform, we're now in the top 5% most followed.
Wow.
Yeah, and the top 1% most shared. So those messages of asking people to share the podcast around has worked. Yeah, so thanks very much to everyone for doing that.
Thanks for you for making it all happen.
Yeah, well, it is a labor of love. I think the thing that has been a bit of a struggle is whether to do adverts or not, right? Because the Patreon isn't huge by any means. And that's the push really, is to have people, if they have the spare cash, to sort of back it and things like that. And I always find when I listen to podcasts and there's a bunch of adverts, it just annoys me, particularly because, the adverts normally are automated and they're sort of tone deaf. You might be talking about some sensitive subject and then it's like, I'm an extrovert American. Why don't you follow me and my lifestyle blog? And you've just been talking about suicide or something like deeply serious. So I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about adverts.
I do, which is if we don't have a huge clump and if we know they're going to be inappropriate, we might take one or two and say, this may seem inappropriate. That's because it's an advert and we have to live in a capitalist society. Bear with us.
Yeah.
So that we could prepare our audience if we're talking about suicide and they say, I'm so happy. You can say, well, not everyone's so happy, as our podcast indicates. However, we need money to do this. We could reject things like OxyContin ads or something.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm not quite sure how involved that any of us can be in terms of choosing the adverts. It seems to be sort of an automated process, so I don't know.
Oh, okay.
But, I think also actually a special thanks should go to Elle, who's one of the sort of long-term patrons, and he's taken on Discord and some of the social media stuff. And
Great.
He's now sort of really kicked up the reading group stuff as well. So, and there's been some donations that have come through that. So that's been really positive. So, hats off to El for all his work. Maybe this is a bit navel gazing, but just if there are any guests or episodes this year that stuck out for either of you and maybe why.
The guy who did games, it was something I never heard of. So it was really interesting to me to see that.
Yeah. There was a couple there, Alfie Bown and John Barnes.
Yeah.
John Bales, sorry.
Just because I wasn't, I'm not in that know. And so it was very exciting. And it also helped me with my clients because some of them are interested in that and I was ignorant about it.
Yeah, Ikoi, did you have a sort of anything that you remember that stuck out?
Well, I think, interviewing Elisa.
Yeah.
There is definitely a difference between, I think, like interviewing authors and interviewing people who have, gone through a specific experience.
Yeah.
Not to say that like one's better than the other. It's just a very different experience, even from the interviewing end.
Yeah, to that point, Tracy Higgins.
Yes, that's what I was thinking too.
Yeah, recovering from paranoid schizophrenia. That was episode 77. So she had a foot in both places, really. She was an author, I guess, but she also ultimately, she was writing about her experience of her life, basically, and getting to the place where she was in a sort of safer, healthier place. And it was a very difficult read and, very interesting to sort of chat to her.
That stood out for me too.
My highlights definitely were Douglas Rushkoff with the Survival of the Richest, which, has sort of surfaced with Elon Musk buying Twitter and appearing to be yeah, exactly. And then the recent one that we did with Brett Scott about cashless society and the sort of financial tech stuff. Someone had said on Patreon that was one of their favorite episodes so far. That was really great to read. I'm sort of looking forward to, in particular, in the new year, there's these two people who've written this paper on right-wing psychedelia. So this whole idea that psychedelics are going to make everyone peace and love and we're all going to hold hands. They show something sort of very different. So that's one of the things I'm really looking forward to. One of the interesting things, I guess, that has happened in the last month is that this, just in terms of something that kind of relates to the mental health world, is this AI tech ChatGPT landed and everyone started using it. They, got over 1 million users very, very fast. And one of the things that's been interesting about that is in sharing some of the stuff with the Discord members, Ikoi, you were very quickly like, oh, this advice sounds like cognitive behavioral therapy, right? You can just type in, I don't know, something that you're going through, and it might, and if you're asking this chat bot for some help, it will supply various different answers. And it's interesting because I can see there is a sort of convenience factor, right? Like if you're struggling with something, immediately you can turn to one of these apps, and particularly this ChatGPT, I think, is impressive for that. I mean, the advice is only ever going to go so far, but there's been some really interesting applications I've seen of it online. Like so for example, again, this might all just be twee and sort of rubbish, and it doesn't really help anything. But somebody had they had written in the prompts of like who their heroes are, and then they said, this is a situation I'm going through. What would my my hero say to me, or something like that? And the replies were kind of, what it generated was actually pretty interesting.
Right. It was coherent.
Yeah, it's very coherent. And obviously, this thing can't pay your rent or feed you or, solve these sort of real problems. But it does make me think, some of the stuff that both of you have spoken about in the past of, every profession has its people that just half-assing it and they can't be bothered, and that therapy is no exception. And that if you have, for whatever reason, there may be sympathetic reasons as well, that you've sort of checked out or tuned out from your patient's concerns, then if you are relying on this sort of flowchart tick box advice, then this piece of software is going to cause you problems because this is going to be open to everyone to use. Well, right now it's free, and it's going to give the same advice that you might be giving, right? So what does that do? What's the future of sort of mental health service in 2023?
Right, and that kind of goes concurrently with the I guess the boom of remote mental health treatment.
Right.
BetterHelp and all those apps.
Yeah, they also, all of them deny or at least ignore one of the most basic aspects of therapy that's successful, which is a relationship with someone who understands you, who trusts you, and who listens to you. So chatting, putting out the same recipe for everybody wouldn't quite cut it on the relational aspect of therapy.
Yeah. The flip side of that is that just like back in the day with Eliza, that program that was the first sort of chatbot that was ever invented and that was very well received by the guy who invented it. His receptionist spent a lot of time conversing with it. And asked it all kinds of personal questions that it would reply back. I think we've spoken about it in the past. There's an Adam Curtis clip I'll put in the show notes, but it's that thing of like the benefit of that stuff seems to be that there's no judgment, right? And it seems to me from conversations I've had with both of you and guests have revealed that a lot of the time people feel burnt by therapy because they felt like they were coming to someone who they thought was going to help them, who ultimately just compounded the problem and made them feel kind of worse about, XYZ thing. So, you can see the appeal of this tech approach, however flawed.
Right. I mean, and also one of the things that people, say about the benefit of technology is that like you don't have to, oftentimes with these AI type, not online, but like AI type mental health applications, is the immediacy. You have somebody replying back to you right away.
Yes.
And that day or night, doesn't matter, right? It could be 3 a.m. And you type out something. You're going to get an immediate response. And in that sense, I think in terms of like extreme distress, it can be
it's like a hotline.
Yeah. That there are certain potentially beneficial applications for these technologies. But yeah, again, it's ultimately one of the issues is that, capitalism has always been a form where the best practices are reserved for people of means.
Absolutely.
There is always pros and cons to new evolving technology. And a lot of times I think there sometimes can be a certain panic that ignores some of the pros, but also the cons is this leading to a lesser level of care for people in need, right? Because usually, people without means has a lot more things to be distressed about. They are much more in need of care in many ways. And it seems that these are the people that, often always get exempt from the best care. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a class system of care and of mental health as well as every other aspect of U.S. life, that those people who are on insurance panels, for those lucky people who have insurance, are usually less experienced and or don't get clients. And those who do get a lot of clients usually don't take insurance.
Right.
So it eliminates huge swaths of people in need. And that is ignored. Britain has a cabinet ministry of loneliness. The United States doesn't, even though people are evidently breaking down. You walk in the streets of New York City, where I live, and you see crazies. There's just no question. People raving to themselves, people upbraiding whoever walks by, people who are obviously caught in an internal problem from which they can't see them. They can't differentiate their inner and their outer lives, which is a sign of psychosis when you lose the social link. And they're there.
There's a really interesting link I'll include from ourworldindata.org, and it shows how Americans spend their time. I'm pretty sure it must be very similar in the UK. But it's a sort of interactive chart, and it is, literally off the charts. The majority of time is spent alone. Between 40 to 80 is when it sort of skyrockets. And if you have a partner, that's the sort of second thing. But it's a really interesting chart, and I'll include it in the show notes. But to your point about the alone thing, it's kind of extreme when you see it in chart form.
Well, and also one of the things about, I remember this is a conversation that I was having with a random person having a drink at a bar. One of the things that, he was working, mainly doing construction. He was in his early 30s, and he was just talking about how expensive everything was, which meant, he was living in a house. It was a 4-bedroom house that, 6 people were renting.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was just like, yeah, like, this idea of being able to have my own space is such a, like, it's one of those things where he's like, I've never been so alone, constantly surrounded by people and having no privacy in my life before.
Wow. That's dramatic.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
This pandemic has only increased the aching loneliness, and connection is the basis of mental health. And so that is huge, because all the casual connections of daily life are minimized. If you're wearing a mask, you can't even smile at the people on the street who smile back at you. And people don't talk online waiting at the store anymore. People get to be a source of pestilence and disease instead of connection. And so the usual loneliness of capitalism, where individualism and competition are encouraged rather than collective action, and encouraged in school, you don't get grades for doing things together. You don't get a doctorate for writing your dissertation with somebody else. You have to do it all alone. And all the casual kindness and interactions are minimized, so that it's really difficult to connect, even in a city of 8.5 million people where I live.
That's a good point. Ikoi, did you want to finish what you were going to say?
Harriet kind of, walked right into what I was phasing into, which is how the pandemic has made that worse for a lot of people. Because also, depending on your living situation, if you have roommates, you're not necessarily stuck with people you would choose to be stuck with.
Yeah, even the casual sexual connections that people used to have, the gay clients I have who used to count on casual hookups can't, because monkeypox makes them terrified.
Right.
And so do all the other things. So that I looked at the personals that used to be, wanted woman or man for casual connection, whatever, wanted divorced or whatever, single for casual connection, weekday evenings, are now lonely. I'm a driver. Will you sit next to me while I drive?
Whoa.
And one guy said, I have a beach house far away. Will you come in and stay with me? I'll ask nothing else than that you stay with me. They had a whole different character. Instead of casual sex or a particular kink, they were loneliness.
Yes, you're lonely up until the point you're annoyed. Not to make light of this terrible pandemic and everything that's come of it. But I was speaking to Ikoi earlier about this 4-paneled meme, and a person sort of in bed and they're sort of wishing they were playing video games. They're playing video games and they wish they were outside doing something fun. They're outside and they wish they were back in bed, It's like... yeah, people say they're lonely and then they spend, a couple of hours with someone who irritates them and they can't wait to get away. But, maybe I'm projecting.
No, I think that's valid. I even saw a very cute cartoon of this older couple watching television. And the woman says to the man, gay marriage? Haven't they suffered enough?
Well, I mean, and I think it's also important to remember that a lot of times, all these negative experiences like isolation doesn't necessarily make you more tolerant of people. It can actually make you less tolerant of people and a lot less able to have, the patience oftentimes to kind of like get over that, first awkward bumps of getting to know people.
Yeah.
That's a really great point, because I was looking at studies. Animals that are isolated become hostile when other animals are entering their cage, because they feel more guarded in their aloneness, so that this isolation of people hasn't necessarily made them eager or welcoming of connection. So that's another scary effect of isolation.
People want it, but they lose the skills to attain it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, is kind of like, it kind of puts people in like a more frustrating, downward spiral, because a lot of times people want these connections, but isolation often means that you're already kind of in a disappointed state with humanity oftentimes.
Yes, that's true.
And a lot of times people end up picking up on what's disappointing rather than what's connecting.
Mm-hmm. Because they're so disappointed.
Right.
Because if you're alone, you have unrealistic expectations also.
Right. And so it's just kind of like this downward spiral. And then you kind of mix that in with, lack of privacy oftentimes in your living situation, because you have to share, living space with people that you don't necessarily get along with all the time, or that, you would by choice live with, right? If money wasn't an object. So, I mean, again, like there are people that are like, man, like having roommates saved my ass during the pandemic. If they get along with their roommates, it can be a very positive experience in that regard. But if you don't really have a good connection, with your roommate, where it is really a transactional type of situation, then it can amplify loneliness, right? This the what the guy said about, like, he's never felt so lonely in his life, but without any privacy.
Yeah, that's a very important point. And also, one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is that domestic abuse has spiked because you can't escape.
Right.
The kind of thing. That's right. And kids who are abused are often picked up at school, where the teacher notices their bruises. And that doesn't happen if the kids are home. And people don't have other people to talk to. So if they're in an abusive situation, it's much harder to escape.
Yeah.
So something we'll close up. But something that came up recently was that someone on the Discord felt that sometimes in observing some of these things, or talking about some of the issues that get raised on the podcast, that it becomes almost like the same thing as the sort of isolation thing, and then losing the ability to socialize. That is there a sort of doomer aspect? Like, sure, we can talk about all these problems, but okay, then what? We're like, what are the solutions? Like, how does any of this stuff get solved? Or, particularly if you're just one person, how do you confront all of these huge issues that even in talking about this stuff, it can feel overwhelming?
That's a point. That's a very good point.
Yeah. And so obviously one of the sort of reoccurring themes is connecting with other people, and by extension, if you can do some sort of community organizing, whether that's union led or just something in your neighborhood or whatever, then that can be a potentially progressive step. But given, I guess, different people that listen, different sort of things that different people want to do or enjoy, are there sort of alternatives to join a union, join an organization? Because on one hand, there's evidence to show that is very empowering, but for some people, that's probably the last thing they want to do, or even the last thing they want to hear in regards to something that, this is going to fix me or help me or something like that. Like, are there sort of other things? I know we're speaking sort of in generalizations, I guess, so it's probably very difficult to say, but are there sort of other tools in the toolkit that you can think off the top of your head?
I think the joining is empowering, whether on the internet or in person. And, if you want to start with something apolitical, you could join a walking group, so you only see people outside, but you get to know people and you're also moving, and that helps to join a walking group. But also, there are political and non-political groups that organize online and communicate online so that it's safer, but you have connection, you have visual and auditory connection.
And I think, also whatever, if you are religious, I think joining a church or a synagogue or a temple can always be a potential, positive experience.
Potential.
Yes, potential. I mean, especially, if sometimes like, one of my friends joined a church recently. And part of the reason that, she joined was because the church does a lot of services for the homeless. And so she felt that it was a good opportunity for her to maybe, direct the services in a more expansive way.
I think that's excellent because it also points to joining service organizations that work together but are respectful of, contagion. Because there's a lot of things like that, whether they're blood drives or whether they're political groups, there are a lot of things.
And sometimes joining a already, established, not having to start things from scratch can be a lot less overwhelming for people. So she has really enjoyed, working in that capacity there. And so a lot of it, I think it's very apt for a lot of people to feel overwhelmed by, the problems of system and society. But ultimately, the purpose of podcasts like these is not to depress people, but you can't solve a problem unless you can see what the problem is clearly.
Yeah.
And also, hopefully, people can kind of generate some individual ideas of how they can create some kind of influence in ways, big or small.
And that they can connect safely, which is important because the connection is important.
Yeah, I think the value of focusing on some of the systemic issues is partly also just to give yourself some slack. If you're not like a perfect human being, it's not exactly like the world is built for you to succeed, whatever that looks like, always part of the whole, the reason to look at all these different things or the way that they work together is to recognize that this stuff hasn't always been built in your best interests. And I say that as a white guy, so, lol, what am I talking about? Anyway, I think we can end it there.
Just because you're white and male doesn't mean you're without any issues. In fact, in the United States, white males are probably some of the people most troubled, even if they may not acknowledge it.
Yeah.
They're certainly the most violent, which is not a
healthy.
No, it's not a mentally healthy expression.
But yeah, just to sort of wrap it up, I mean, Merry Christmas to both of you, and I hope you have a nice holiday. And for the listeners as well, like they'll probably hear this in the new year, so hope it was a good one.
Good. Yes. And Happy New Year and everything. Good.
Yes.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Alex Placito, Bruce Rogers-Vaughan, Jennifer Cox, Rebecca Johns, Seamus O'Connell, Sheena Belmas, and Ethan.
If you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And you can hear more from Harriet on her radio show called Interpersonal Update. It's on Wednesday afternoons and in the WBAI archives.